The following program deals with a controversial subject. The theories expressed are not the only possible interpretation. Viewers are invited to make a judgment based on all available information.
This is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent into
madness. Open your mind.
And we are back to another edition of West of the Rockies. I'm Frank. Thank you guys for sticking around. I know it's late, but we have a really cool show ahead for everyone tonight. As always, if you enjoy the topics I cover on this show, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, and click the bell to get notified when new interviews are published. I'm currently working on a couple of interviews that I hope to have up soon, and you won't want to miss them. You can also subscribe to West of the Rockies on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you checked out my recent interview on YouTube with John Potash about his latest documentary, CIA, Drugs or Us, you likely noticed that the show got a bit of a facelift. Let me know what you think about the new look in the comments below, and after this, don't forget to check out my interview with John on his documentary CIA, Drugs or Us if you haven't already done so. We discuss some pretty explosive subject matter that he covers in his latest film. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome one of my favorite authors, Walter Bosley, back on the show to dive into his book, NIMSA, How America Sold Its Soul. For those not familiar, Walter Bosley is an investigator of historical occult mysteries, a pulp fiction author, and a screenwriter who has made appearances on History Channel's Ancient Aliens, sharing his unique insights into the hidden past and the arcane forces that continue to fascinate and inspire. His multifaceted career spans the realms of mystery and intrigue, where he delves into the secrets of the past and brings them to light through his published works, making him a sought-after voice in both the realms of mystery and fiction. Born in San Diego, he earned his BA in journalism from San Diego State University and has since built an impressive resume that includes working for the FBI, serving as a special agent in the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and later acting as a counter-terrorism operational consultant. His globe-trotting adventures, including trips through Mexico and South America with David Hatcher Childress, have enriched his investigations and writings, with his work featured in publications such as Wex magazine. After 19 years in national security, Walter transitioned to civilian life as a licensed private investigator in California, where he also runs his publishing company, Lost Continent Library, founded in 2002. When he's not on a PI assignment, Bosley dedicates his time to writing fiction and non-fiction, continuously exploring strange mysteries that captivate his curiosity. His ongoing projects and latest news can be followed on his website, walterbosley.com, and the Walter Bosley channel on YouTube, offering listeners and readers a window into his relentless pursuit of the unknown. Tonight's topic is one of Walter's recent books titled NIMSA, How America Sold Its Soul, which was published in 2023. In this book, Walter presents his exploration of a secretive organization with deep historical roots that Bosley argues played a hidden yet transformative role in American history, particularly after World War II. In this book, Bosley traces a lineage that connects medieval methods of invasion and conquest to modern covert operations, suggesting that this mysterious group infiltrated the fabric of American political, financial, and social life. He contends that the United States was compromised from within, using tactics reminiscent of a Trojan horse to further agendas that eventually eroded the nation's core principles. The book explores the murky intersections of history, conspiracy, and alternative narratives. Drawing on historical research and investigative insights, Bosley weaves together elements of Nazi technology, exploited through programs like Operation Paperclip, secret societies, and long-forgotten historical traditions. The result is a controversial thesis that challenges conventional understandings of America's post-war evolution and invites readers to reconsider the hidden forces that may have shaped contemporary events. Those of you who have followed the show over the years know that, as I mentioned, Walter is one of my all-time favorite authors. And if you're a novice to West of the Rockies, buckle up, because tonight you will find out why. So, fasten your seatbelt, stow away your tray tables, and let's welcome Walter Bosley to West of the Rockies. Walter, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Well, Frank, it's good to be talking with you again. I always enjoy it.
As I said at the top of the show, I'm not shy about telling people you're one of my all-time favorite authors. Every one of your books has been very insightful, and they always make me approach subjects or topics I may think I have a bit of a handle on from a different angle, and I really dig that. The book we're going to discuss here tonight is no exception. First, let me ask you this question. What inspired you to write NIMSA, How America Sold Its Soul? Was there a specific historical moment that triggered this investigation?
Yeah, well, it was really my realization in doing some research relative to Operation Paperclip, and then my book Origin, in which I talk about the NIMSA of Delshow. And I just kind of had an epiphany that, quite frankly, was very depressing. Because, as you know, I spent 20 years in the U.S. national security community, between multiple agencies, including the military, dedicating my professional life to national defense, right? Mm-hmm. And to think that it was for something other than what I thought I was protecting was quite the shock. And I had started back in, I think it was 2017, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 16, that I started to do a video series on the topic for my YouTube. And I got a couple of episodes done, and I could not continue. It just bothered me so much to realize that a coup was, committed against the U.S. with the JFK assassination, a coup by invaders who came into this country through Operation Paperclip. And it really, for me, was disturbing material. But I eventually had to follow through with it, and get my research out there. So I decided instead, a couple of years back, to write the book, NIMSA, How America Sold Its Soul. I had to get that out there. And of all the books I've written, this was the one that was just simply not fun to write. I love writing. I love doing this research. And in different ways, I've enjoyed every book I've written, except that one. That one was, it was tough for me to write, but I felt like it was important.
It's funny you mentioned that, because yeah, it's true. I read your other books, Origins, Latitude 33, mm-hmm. Shimmering Light, mm-hmm. and a couple of others. In all your books, you can sense your tone, which to me always comes across as that of exploration and wonder. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, this book does have a slightly more sinister undertone, like a dark cloud, if you will.
Yeah.
As you mentioned a few moments ago, you served in the FBI as a special agent in the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and later worked as a counterterrorism operational consultant. How has your background influenced your approach to uncovering these shadowy aspects of history?
Well, first of all, it really trained me in being a professional investigator. And what I mean by that is to have the integrity of being, of using those professional ethics, basing things on evidence, no matter what kind of evidence it is. What I mean by that is if it's documentary evidence or if it's witness evidence or some type of other material thing, because there's different types of evidence. But to, not just go willy-nilly with one source that I don't really attempt to verify or confirm. It really prepared me to, I think, do this research the right way, and that's why I feel really confident with my books. Of course, I footnote them. I provide bibliography. I present the sources. And that is a direct influence from my days as a federal investigator and intelligence collector.
I can imagine how, for some listeners new to this topic and for the skeptics, what we're going to discuss here tonight may sound straight out of a science fiction novel or a downright fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Writing this book, how did you balance well-documented research with the more speculative elements of the research?
Well, with NIMSA, How America Sold Its Soul, it's one of my most, from my perspective, it's one of my most grounded works of them all, because I base it on history.
Speaking of history, where does the word NIMSA come from? I know we've covered this previously in a past interview, which I'll link in the description for the folks watching on YouTube. For those new to this topic, can you tell us what the word means or what it stands for and how you came across it?
The word and the name NIMSA comes to us from Charles Delshow, who is our single original source of the word NIMSA, and the mysterious Sonora Aero Club, which, boy, that's another conversation in itself, and I've written about them quite a bit. But NIMSA was a German-based organization that was involved with private research into exotic technologies. Now, the short version of how that led to my book is that I discovered that within the works of Charles Delshow, he illustrated these flying machines that he claimed were being built in the 1850s, the decade before our Civil War in the United States. And one of the devices, the motive parts of the propulsion lift system, was literally a rudimentary proof of concept version of what we today know as the Bell, Die Glocke. Well, you had a German organization that was sponsoring, the development of this Bell prototype in the 1850s. And then we have the legendary Die Glocke, or the Bell, which is connected to the Nazi scientists of the 20th century. So I started pulling the threads, the historical threads, not just the fantastical technology threads, but, historical threads. And I came to a proposed conclusion that this group, this mysterious NIMSA group of Delshow, was one of the driving forces behind the changes in Germany going into the 20th century, which led to the rise of the Nazi Party. And I argue that the Nazis got the Bell not from a crashed, reverse-engineered flying saucer, but from steady human development that Charles Delshow tells us, goes back to the 1850s and actually may actually be the result of the Macquarn-Rankine turbine, which is virtually identical to the schematic that Charles Delshow provides for what powered and provided lift for these 1850s flying machines. So there's a human technological line of research going back to the early 19th century. So that's much more grounded than the reverse engineering of a crashed flying saucer from another world, which I know is popular. But the facts and evidence just don't support that as much as they support the human thread. So I looked at World War II history. And when I started connecting the threads between what was going on in the era of Delfzijl-Nimza in the mid-19th century and what was going on during the World War II era, I found legitimate historical connections, threads connecting these two. So it's my opinion that this Nimza organization, whatever they actually were very much involved with the development of Nazi Germany, because I discovered also that Nazi Germany was using a model that dated back to Germany of the medieval era. And it was recommended to me by my friend Joseph Farrell, an author that your listeners are familiar with, I'm sure. And he told me about the book by Paul Winkler titled The 1,000-Year Conspiracy. And in that book, Winkler lays out the model for how the Prussian culture, that was behind the unification of Germany in the late 19th century, and then leading into the circumstances that supported Nazi Germany's rise. Winkler shows how in the medieval era, the same practices of ingratiating with a state or another country and then turning on them after you gain control from within. And this is something that the what we call the Prussian culture has been doing since the medieval era. It's rather shocking. Now, here's what really got me was that Winkler writes this book in 1937, 2 years before World War II begins. And what he talks about in that book describes what was done to the United States through Operation Paperclip and since the end of World War II to a T. And what's spooky about that is, again, Winkler wrote this book before World War II even began. So that was kind of a shock to me. The problem with Winkler's book is that he does not footnote it. But when you look at Germany's history and go back, it fits properly. This is German history that he's talking about. So I began to look more closely at the history of the United States since the end of World War II. And I realized, oh my God, that's what they did. They did the ingratiation phase through Operation Paperclip. A lot of people don't realize is Operation Paperclip, the idea came from the Germans. It was the German scientists who went to Colonel Armstrong, U.S. Army Air Force, went to him and said, hey, the Germans did. They said, hey, we can bring a bunch of our science and tech guys over to work for you guys. Just bring us into the United States. And of course, Armstrong said, heck, that's a great idea. So these were primarily aerospace medicine scientists. That's a thing I talk about in the book, and the importance of aerospace medicine, particularly to putting man in space. So Operation Paperclip was primarily driven by the guys who were the experts pursuing manned spaceflight. It wasn't the bomb. It wasn't just rocket guys. It was the aerospace medicine guys who their longtime dream was putting man in space. And that's why Harry Armstrong, Colonel Armstrong, and the others devised Operation Paperclip. But again, it was a German idea, and that equated to a Trojan horse. Beware of them, Greeks bearing gifts, right?
Right.
So they get in through the Trojan horse that is Operation Paperclip. They are instrumental in really founding and expanding what the United States knows as its military-industrial complex. Okay? For all intents and purposes, our military-industrial complex is a product of the post-World War II era, Operation Paperclip, etc. And they had built this up. They had gotten their claws into it, okay? And they wanted to expand their powers to take it to the next level. John F. Kennedy was someone who was opposed to, their desires and how they wanted things to go. Eisenhower tried to warn us, but Eisenhower was cautious. He was more cautious than Kennedy. He didn't buck him. He didn't push him too much. So the big move was the assassination of JFK. Now, when you look at the history of the medieval Prussians who were really driving this 1,000-year conspiracy that Paul Winkler talks about, okay, they had an arm of their effort called the Firma. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I could be mispronouncing it, Fehme. And this was a group of men who were judge, jury, and executioner. You never knew their faces, but if you opposed what this Prussian culture, this Prussian special interest group wanted, they would find some reason that you had to be eliminated. And they would do it, and they would very often, most often, do it violently and in a public manner to send a message. And the assassination of JFK fits right in with how that organization would do their public assassinations. So, to me, it just increasingly became more and more obvious that this is what's happened. The United States was really essential control of the direction of our country, with the military-industrial complex benefiting the most. And at the point of this, that's who's running it, in my opinion, or the post-war Nazi structure, okay? And they continued their structure, they continued their operations once they got in the United States.
One of the things that really trips me out is that it appears that this was all put in motion, as you mentioned, in the 19th century.
Uh-huh.
And when I was reading your book, there is a chapter where you list suspected members of this group, NIMZA.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but notice that many of them were philosophers, chemists, individuals one would imagine were reasonably intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
However, they all seem to have an inclination towards mysticism. Can you tell me about that? Because in today's age, it looks like science and mysticism are at odds with each other. How did these seemingly well-educated and intelligent men reconcile their scientific and academic backgrounds with their study and interest in mystical traditions?
Well, the great scientists, for the longest time, these were the philosopher scientists, because the more you look at reality, the more fantastic things you're going to see. The more you're going to be open to what we call mystical, right? Now, here's an interesting thing. In the Western world, Western civilization, for quite a time, it was however the Royal Society went, that's how science goes, right? And in 1830, there was a big turning point in science in the Royal Societies, okay? Now, the Royal Society was founded by these brilliant philosopher scientists, guys who were, material grounded scientists who were also alchemists, who were also philosophers, okay? Now, your technician scientists, which some people call the bean counters, just stick to your specialty and don't be a generalist. And they hated these guys, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so finally, in 1830, when they outnumbered the philosopher scientists, when the bean counter technicians outnumbered the philosopher scientists, they took over the Royal Society. And they guided our modern era of science from 1830 on to be more focused on the specialists, the more technician scientists. Now, here's the thing. I'm not condemning that, because look at the amazing advances in science and technology we've had, happen to have had since then, okay? But what's happened is science has lost an appreciation for what we call the mystical. Remember, the philosopher scientists, they were well-rounded, right? They were more generalists. So they had a perspective that they understood chemistry, they understood geology, they understood, astronomy, all these different disciplines, and they were able to put together a more comprehensive perception, picture of reality, how things were as a whole. Okay? Well, there's some folks that, of course, they don't want that. They don't want you to have a grasp on what it really is, what's really out there, what's really going on. They want you to stick to your specialty, stay in your lane, right? Mm-hmm. So these guys you're talking about that I've identified in the book, these were the guys that still appreciated, the more comprehensive, well-rounded approach. And they were able to put two and two together from what they were finding. Okay, they were more open-minded. And so therefore, they were more flexible in their pursuits of certain technologies and developing those. Okay, so the other appeal of that for these guys and guys like them was the fact that the philosophers, scientists in England who were brought together that formed the Royal Society, what originally brought them together, believe it or not, was a search for Atlantis. These were guys who were Atlantists, and they all suspected and believed that there was something that would support the theory of Atlantis. Now, they were brought together literally to create a navy for England. Okay, that was what they were ordered to do. But these guys were all interested in the lost ancient world. They were very keenly interested in the information and knowledge that was lost, for example, with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Okay, mm-hmm. So these were the kind of guys who they would be involved in secret societies. They would be involved with the search for this lost knowledge. And from that lost knowledge, they would try to fashion together, these exotic technologies. Now, I think the bell is something that's very real. I think it is Vedic in its origins. Now, when I say Vedic, I mean that within the context dating before the India we know today. Now, think how long India has been around and throughout history, but this lost Vedic knowledge and civilization predates even, the ancient history of the India we know today. I think that's where the knowledge that has gone into the development of this thing we call the bell, Deglaka, I think that's where it comes from. And these guys, they were interested in these things. They were open to these things. So if they couldn't pursue the ideas openly, for whatever reasons, the bean counters, the technician scientists, the stay in your lane scientists were in control of everything because they had the majority. Well, they would do this on the side. They would come together secretly and quietly and just work on these alternative exotic technologies, regardless of the direction known industry was going. So their interest, to answer your question in a roundabout way, I think their interest was a very practical interest. It wasn't as a fantastical pursuit as one might think to them from their perspective.
One of the names that stood out to me in the list of suspected NIMSA members included in your book is that of Karl Kellner, who was a chemist and an inventor. Not only that, but he was also the founder of the legendary and infamous Ordo Templi Orientis, also known as the OTO.
Yes.
You touched on it a moment ago, but can you expand on how this organization operated? Because if I have my facts correct, the people we're talking about here lived during very conservative times. How did these organizations like the OTO, which is an organization deeply connected to occult and mystical practices, some of which years later would be based on the writings of Aleister Crowley, manage to operate in a very conservative society without being shunned or subject to religious persecution?
I would say they operated very carefully, right, for that reason. But think of it this way. That also served their purpose, because being forced to be very careful and discreet that meant that you could also be highly selective in who you brought into your circle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they could vet only the most qualified not just scientifically and technically, but qualified philosophically. So they could have time and room to really, really look at somebody, learn what they were really about, and they could select people who would respect and understand the need to be discreet, right? Because, you go back to the early 19th century and you have Percy Shelley writing Frankenstein,
Mm-hmm.
and he initially publishes it under the pseudonym Anonymous. Well, he put stuff in that book that he could have gone to prison for because it was forbidden.
Wow.
Forbidden science, right? Now, this is why years after he wrote it and after it was initially released anonymous, they put Mary's name on it. Yes, I'm an advocate that I agree with Scott DeHart that Percy Shelley wrote that book. Mary Shelley did not, and that's a very, I know, unpopular opinion in some circles. But if you read Scott DeHart's book, Shelley Unbound, it lays it all out there. But it's an example of the lengths to which Percy Shelley had. And now, don't get me wrong, Mary was very much a participant in this. She totally agreed and understood why it had to be done that way. Mary Shelley was no idiot at all. She grasped these concepts and she helped him write the book and stuff, but it was not something, she invented. It's something he had to be very careful with the ideas in it, or again, he would have gone to prison. He would have been in serious trouble. And that was just the early 19th century. Now, by the time you get to the late 19th century, had he written Frankenstein 100 years later, or even 75 years later, would have been no problem.
Right.
And a lot of it has to do with, unfortunately, the power that religious institutions have over our societies. It doesn't matter, where you are in the world. The religion is a very powerful force on the human psyche, and it was engineered to be so and is used as such. And in those days, even more so was its power. So Shelley had to be careful about that. But what's interesting about that 19th century is it started way more strict than it ended. Okay, so these guys understood firsthand the need for the discretion, but they also understood that a label of fantastical or evil or heretical would be slapped on something that the powers that be simply just did not want people to have. Okay, they want society and civilization to follow a particularly prescribed course, and anybody that wants to accelerate that outside of their control, well, they have to be labeled, ostracized, and condemned.
We could do a whole hour on the influence and impact of religion, which would be a great topic of discussion. And we could plan for that for a later interview because I would love to hear your insights on that. But let me get back to the NIMSA book.
Uh-huh.
One of the things I wanted to ask was that it appears once NIMSA laid roots in North America, they turned their attention toward the South and began some expeditions to South America. What was the goal? What was their motivation? I know back then there were all these legends of cities of gold and similar stories in the Southern Hemisphere. Was that their only motivator? Or was there more to their expeditions?
Well, I think that it was twofold. They were looking for gold because when Germany unified, they were put on a gold standard. So the new unified Germany needed gold. But it actually started earlier on this very model that I'm talking about that Paul Winkler writes in his 1937 book, which, by the way, was published first in English in 1943 during the war.
Wow.
So even when it was published, it was before the end of the war, before the Operation Paperclip Nazis effected this invasion and then subsequent coup. But what he talks about them doing in the medieval era, okay, they then started taking this method outside of Germany. And what they wanted to do was get a German presence, okay, in this case, South America. And so they started their South American presence pretty strongly by the early 19th century. And it was that very model of first there's presence, then there's ingratiation, there's bringing German industry, German industrial ideas and methods and systems to these foreign countries, helping these countries advance technologically and economically through their participation with the German industrialists, okay? And then from there, you want to start developing political influence, okay? And what they ended up with was the influence they had in places like Argentina and Chile. And this is why, there were the safe havens for the Nazis who fled at the end of the war. Now, to be clear, I see Nazi Germany as a product of this Prussian influence of this special interest group called NIMSA. Okay, so Germany was defeated in World War II, but the Nazis actually were not completely defeated. Okay, and their brand of fascism, okay, was this corporate political idea. But what was really behind it was the influence of this medieval culture of control that was started by the Prussians of the medieval era. So they're really the ones driving it. And the model that they used between the German states and then other places in Europe, and then finally bringing it over to the Americas, this is the very model that they finally also used on the United States at the end of World War II. But it was for both the gold, the more practical, superficial thing was for the gold, or obvious thing on the surface was the gold, but their presence there that had been founded upon this medieval method of ingratiation and then takeover, okay, that put them in place, okay, that gave them the development time there so that they could learn about what the actual sources of gold were. So they had that advantage. And those are the two main reasons I really think you see, Germany moving into South America in particular in the 19th century.
It's wild to think that Germany has been such a strong force of influence. And I'll speak for myself. I guess I have this mental image of World War II Germany as the pinnacle of German power and influence at a global level. Unfortunately, not for good, of course, as history shows. But it would appear that this was in the works way before that.
Yeah. And to put a finer point on it, we're not talking about Germany in general, because the basic German culture is as we know it. I mean, I love going to Germany. I enjoy the heck out of Germany. And a lot of people do. Germany's a wonderful place, to visit and such. And their contributions for centuries in art and science and all that, it's been amazing. Of course, we're talking specifically this special interest group that was behind the rise of the Prussian subculture. Okay, these are the guys who have this corporate image or this corporate vision that led to fascism in Germany. They love that because it fits right with their model. So you're talking a particular subculture, almost like you could say a particular political party or a movement, and you see the presence and the influence of this in America today through certain special interest groups that people might not think had that kind of influence in their founding or the way they go about business, so to speak.
And thanks for clarifying. Yeah, we definitely don't want people to think we're talking about all Germans or all of Germany. We're definitely speaking about a very specific group.
Oh no, believe me, when this subculture that Winkler writes about in his book, when they were doing their thing in the medieval era, they were victimizing and terrorizing Germans. Okay, Now remember, Germany back then was not unified. It was 48 states, independent states and regions, right? So this Prussian culture would attach itself to one of the states. They started with the Teutonic Knights. Okay, they were their friends. They helped raise them to power and even greater wealth, and then they started sticking knives in their backs, and they were instrumental in their destruction after ingratiating themselves as friends. And they used them and terrorized fellow Germans. So this is a subculture that did this to their own people.
Yeah, that's wild. I wanted to return to the expeditions to South America for a moment.
Sure.
One of the things I want to touch on is that these Nimza expeditions were not undertaken by caravans of horse-drawn carriages.
Mm-hmm.
It appears that they were using some type of airship technology to travel south. I know that sounds like make-believe to some folks,
right?
But there is some evidence to support that there were some type of flying machines, and they were not, and I want to be clear here, we're not talking about hot air balloons. We're talking about airships.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it is alleged. We do have to remember that as far as this mysterious Nimza group's association with the airship mysteries, and I say that plural because with the Sonora Aero Club, which Charles Delshow talks about, we have the 1850s airship mystery. They were smaller scale, again, prototype, again, proof of concept. But when you look at the descriptions, okay, by witnesses of the 1890s airship mystery, of the better known Great Airship Mystery, okay, what you're looking at is just the same technology advanced 40 years later, okay? Right down to some of the description of the motive devices seen on these 1890s airships. You can find those in Delshow's description of the 1850s aeros, AEROs, okay? And get this, even in the names of the people involved with these airship mysteries, there is the mysterious Wilson again, and there's another whole show right there. Okay, there was the Wilson of the 1850s Sonora Aero Club, who Delshow writes about. Then, independent of Delshow, in the newspaper reports of the 1890s airship mystery, there are two Wilsons mentioned. Well, I'm in the school of thought that says these were men in the same family, okay, and obviously knowledge passed down through the generations. So when you pull the threads, you see a connection to Delshow's mysterious German group, and you begin to wonder, okay, if this is true, were the other airship sightings, and we have fewer reports to go on for South American airships. There was an airship mystery going on in Russia, I think, at the time. I have not done a deep dive on that yet. And I think there were a few in Western Europe. So based on these stories and these reports, okay, we can suggest that, yeah, they may have been using airships to explore the South American wilderness. And the reason why we have fewer reports is because it was far less populated than North America, than the North American cities, obviously.
Right.
So they could have been flying around, the Andes. They could have been flying around anywhere in the South American wilderness. The Mato Grosso jungle, of course, as we know, is huge, right? And back in the 19th century, they could have been flying their airships over that jungle and never be seen by anyone but the native cultures, and who are they going to tell?
I find that incredibly fascinating. And what I liked about that section of your book is that you also include some eyewitness accounts. There's one from Santiago in Chile, one in Venezuela, but the one that is my favorite, my personal favorite, is the one that occurred in Greenville, Texas on April 17th, 1897. It looks like this one made it to the local paper, the Dallas Morning News. And in this case, it wasn't just a sighting, but also an encounter with the crew of one of these airships, which is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, that one is fascinating because Samuel Tillman, Google him right now, folks. You will see that Colonel Samuel Tillman was a real guy, U.S. Army. During World War I, he was brought up to be the commandant of West Point, during the war, because the commandant had to go on active duty. And Tillman was a real guy, and when I did a deeper dive on him, I found out that he was one of the founding members of the Cosmos Club. He was a chemist with the U.S. Army and a cartographer. And all the things that if you were involved with the development of airships, particularly in the 19th century, these are the kinds of things you might be a specialist in. Now, here's the thing. Colonel Samuel Tillman was not like, it's not like he was a rock and roll star of our times where he was this ultra famous guy. So that if you were making up this story, you would say Mark Twain was on this airship, or Admiral Farragut, people who were more known at the time.
Right.
Why Samuel Tillman? He was still years away from being commandant of West Point. So it's interesting that it's Samuel Tillman. And then there's Amos Dolbear, who was a scientific associate of his, like an electrical engineer, early electrical engineering type. And, that's another guy who, it's not like he was Alexander Graham Bell, So there's less reason to think this story is made up. And there are these people who, bless their hearts, they still buy into the airship mystery of the 1890s being an April Fool's Day joke that newspapermen were playing. I find that so quaint that anybody still, buys into that dismissal, because this is ridiculous. If they still think that, when you really dig into this. And I recommend the research of Michael Busby, Busby. He did an excellent book on the 1890s airship mystery. Some of the best foundational research on the details of this. Anyway, the witnesses were allowed to take a look at the airship and see the devices and the mechanisms on it. And I'm pretty sure that that's the one also where they said that they could travel to Cuba and back in the same day or something like that. When you really dig into these reports and you give an honest look and you see the details, there's really no more reason to just dismiss these stories if you're being honest, with yourself.
Right.
And with the data. But Tillman now, there's another researcher who has taken up the torch on Tillman after my research. And I talk about Tillman and lay this all out in my book Origin. But Daniel List, also known as Dark Journalist, he has done some fantastic thread pulling on Colonel Tillman and uncovered even more, which supports the idea that these airships were real and Tillman was right there in the thick of it.
And that's where I get really pulled into these things. Look, I get how this all can sound like science fiction, but when you start digging and you start finding the roots, and the roots are, as you mentioned earlier, well-grounded, it almost makes you question your understanding of the world, like world history, science, etc.
Yeah.
One of the things I asked myself while I was reading this book is, look, we're talking 19th century. To build these airships, I can't even begin to imagine the type of resources it would take to put together one of these things, especially back in those days. How was NIMSA financing these projects and these expeditions? Was this group made up of very wealthy members of the private sector? Did they have some government backing them, or how did they operate?
Well, these are the kind of guys, and this is the kind of organization that lifted up and backed government. They were true breakaway societies. Okay. They were independent as far as their resources and means were concerned. Now, they were also, men who were the industrialists of the day, and they pooled their own resources. It wouldn't have been as, even when we adjust for inflation as they do, when you look at a historical expenditure and you say, well, adjusting for inflation in 2025 dollars, that would be, oh my gosh. Well, even when you do that, things were not quite as inflated and as expensive as they are today. Okay, because these were, remember, these airships, either at the 1850s or their 1890s descendants. Okay, this was still 19th century technology, 19th century materials to work with. Okay. You couldn't take an 1890s airship and do what a modern Airbus does or a 747. No, I mean, they just were more fragile than a modern jetliner, that kind of thing. That's why when I see the 1890s airship mystery, people want to explain that in terms of, oh, it was UFOs like we see today. I slap my forehead and just shake my head and go, oh my God, guys, stop it. Stop it with the flying saucer stuff, because, tell me you haven't taken an honest close look at the history without saying you haven't taken an honest close look at the history. It's a denial.
Right.
I have a chart, if you recall, in my book, Origin. I call it the Bosley chart, right? And in that chart, I show a Ford Model T automobile. Then I show a 1958 Buick. Then I show, I think, a 1985 Porsche. Now, here's what the chart is. The Arrow, the flying machine or contraption of the 1850s Sonora Aero Club that Delshaw writes about, that's your Model T, okay? Then the airships of the 1890s, 40 years later, that's like your 58 Buick compared to the Model T. Okay. Then your modern, popular, I chose image of the sport model flying saucer that's famously connected to Area 51. I say, now that's your 85 Porsche, 1985 Porsche, and you see how that, what the 58 Buick was to the Model T. Okay.
Right.
The 1890s airship was to the 1850s Arrow, all right? And what the 85 Porsche was to the Buick and the Model T, the sport model popular notion of a flying saucer was to the 1890s and 1850s airships. And the chart lays it out, and I think that's an easy way for people to understand what I'm talking about. So you see a progression of the technology. Now, yes, there was a huge leap between the 1890s airships and whatever the heck has been going on with what we call flying saucers, because by the 1850s, remember, anti-gravity technology research was open source until 1958. And something real mysterious happened because a lid was clamped down on that and has been ever since, really. So there must have been a huge leap forward in the late 50s, of this line of development.
Earlier in the interview, you brought up the Glocke, or the bell, which, to put a bit of context, was a purported top-secret technological device, or Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon, allegedly developed by Nazi Germany in the 1940s.
Yes.
According to some accounts, the Glocke was a bell-shaped machine approximately 12 feet high and 9 feet in diameter, said to harness a mysterious metallic fluid for anti-gravity, free energy, and even time distortion experiments. Since we're talking about the evolution of the airships, How does Die Glocke, the Nazi bell, fit into all this?
I think the bell has had everything to do with it. There's a beautiful book put out by the Stephen Romano Gallery, okay? And it's called The Art of Delschow. And it's the best book on Delschau's art, his claim, his story, his illustrations of what he swore was being built and flown in the 1850s, okay? And I'm the guy that was looking through this book because Stephen sent me a copy. And I'm looking through this book and I see a proof of concept, rudimentary version of the bell. And this is Delschow. He had done this drawing, this painting, sometime after 1893, but before 1923 when he died, which predates Nazi Germany, okay? So he had claimed that these guys used this thing, this bell-shaped thing, and he has a description of it, that they were using this in the 1850s, and that's what gave the ship lift and propulsion. And I called Stephen. I said, Stephen, the bell, they were using the bell. And I told him what page it was on. He goes, oh my God, I've never noticed that. Then I told Joseph Farrell about it because he's, a foremost writer on the Nazi bell. And it blew his mind. He really started looking deeper at it. And he agrees that absolutely this Sonora Aero Club is using it. Proof of concept version of the bell. Now, when you get to the 1890s airship mystery, okay, which I do not think, by the way, I do not think that was a German group building those. And I go into that in my various books. In Secret Missions 3, Destination Carcosa, I specifically lay out the connection between the thread that you follow between the 1850s Sonora Aero Club and the 1890s airship mystery. But I believe it was an American group doing this. But remember, the German guys were the ones who were first messing with this where flight was concerned. And that's a whole other story. But then you have Nazi Germany pop up with Die Glocke, which they took the basic concept of the bell and they juiced it up, right? With all that electricity and God knows what else and the red mercury, so to speak, and such. So, you have that in the mix, and one certainly is looking like it led to the other. And it had nothing to do with reverse engineering any flying saucers that came from another world.
That's fascinating. And again, it blows my mind just how far back the airship mystery goes. I want to bring up another suspected NIMSA member to help us jump into the 20th century and Operation Paperclip, which you also cover in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Hjalmar Schacht. He was a Freemason, and more interestingly, well, I know some may find the Freemason angle interesting, but for me, the more interesting part is that this suspected member of NIMSA served in Adolf Hitler's government not only as the president of the central bank, but also as the minister of economics. And as you mentioned in your book, he lived long enough to see the fruits of Project Paperclip, which was NASA putting a man on the moon. Can you tell me a little bit about Project Paperclip? We know that it was about bringing several German scientists to the US. Some went to the Soviet Union, some went to the UK. However, specifically in the US, it seems it's where they had the most success. Why is NIMSA, and in the context of this discussion, the Nazis, infatuated with space travel and colonizing space? Why is that?
Because this was the original goal of rocketry and aerospace medicine. Now, people hear the words aerospace medicine and they think, oh my God, how boring. Well, guess what? Aerospace medicine is how you develop life support systems. Now, dating back to the 1920s, the aerospace medicine scientists, Strughold and the others who eventually, helped develop NASA and, as you say, put Americans on the moon. From the get-go, they wanted to put man in space, okay? Now, people say, well, no, after Operation Paperclip got them, it was the Cold War, and they wanted to keep air crews alive in high-altitude reconnaissance planes and bombers. And that's what that was all about. No. Their pursuit was always to put man in space, and the high altitude life support system was a side product which was on the way to putting man in space. Now, Colonel Harry Armstrong and one of his subordinates, who became the commander of United States Air Force Aerospace Medicine, okay, they knew all these German scientists before the war. They themselves were part of this pursuit to put man in space, dating back to before World War II. And when the war ended, and then we find ourselves, in the late 40s, and the United States finally stands up an independent U.S. Air Force, well, manned space flight, the pursuit of this, started in the first decade of the United States Air Force. The Mercury program, for example, that, the movie The Right Stuff that a lot of people have seen, our first effort to put, Americans in space. This was the United States Air Force program. All those capsules and the pressure suits and all that stuff was designed and being developed and built as a U.S. Air Force program. And then in the late 50s, specifically October of 58, NASA was stood up. There was an old NACA, but NASA, NASA, which we all like to call never a straight answer. NASA was stood up in the late 50s, and the public and everybody was told, well, they're taking Mercury over. And we're told that the Air Force handed manned space flight, the Mercury program, over to NASA, and that was it. Well, no, that wasn't it. The Air Force still was involved in more discrete and classified pursuit of manned space flight. Okay, they still had their hand in that. NASA just took over the public scientific mission, which was, for public consumption. And the Air Force just quietly continued their pursuit of this. And all these guys who made this happen, putting man in space was their original dream, their original vision all along. And I argue in the book that they used the United States at the end of the war. They saw the writing on the wall, and they used the United States to pursue their dream. Okay? They saw, well, these are the victors. This is the new power in the West. These are the guys with the industrial base. These are the guys with the technological know-how. They're at a high point right now. We can make them better and stronger in this. So we'll do our classic medieval Prussian thing. We'll get ourselves there and look at all the resources we'll have. We'll have the money, the material resources. And another thing we'll do is really stir up this Cold War idea, right? Keep them afraid so that they're constantly building their military. Make them need us. That was their thinking. Make them need us. And we'll get our ticket to spend and do whatever we want by telling them we're going to put you in space to protect your country and protect the free world. But it was because they would get to go in space. In fact, they would make it happen. In the actual documented history that you can point to, the known facts, and in the suggested possibilities that really do more logically fill in the gaps than anything else. This is really, this is really what it's about. And as you know in the book, once they made that possible, and once they kept advancing the technology, the idea was for them to get their culture, their corporate organization, so to speak, into space, and then not need us, and then turn on us, which I think the first big turning point on us, the same way that the medieval Prussians who did this to the Teutonic Knights, the same way that they started to bring down the Teutonic Knights, they have been doing to us since the JFK assassination. And I think that 9/11 was part of what they were doing,
And on that note, can you tell us a bit more about how you connect the threads between this Nazi technology, the medieval methods of conquest, and the modern political shifts in your book?
In my book Origin and in NIMSA, I talk about that. In Origin, I lay out, the whole Deutsche Bank connection to this, the political connections and the influences that I suggest that NIMSA. See, there wouldn't have been, in my opinion, and I present this as my hypothesis, there would not have been a rise of Nazi Germany without NIMSA, whoever they are, backing Germany, backing this specific culture. In other words, I propose that Nazi Germany, the Nazi Party, the Nazi machine, was a product of the NIMSA influence.
Wow, that's pretty heavy.
And we see the signs of this fascism in, and have seen it, getting stronger in the United States, particularly over the last, since the 1980s. And Halmer Schacht, to go back to Halmer Schacht, okay, he was doing the very things we're talking about. Okay, you can look at Halmer Schacht and see that he was doing this thing with German industry. For instance, after World War I, the armistice limited Germany, right? They were not allowed to make military vehicles. They were not allowed to make weapons. They were not allowed to, do these kinds of things.
Correct.
So Halmer Schacht was involved. He wasn't the only one, but he was involved with, this is how Nazi Germany got around it. And folks, this is history. This is known history. These are facts. What did Germany do? They started going to, German industry started going to other countries and helping them build factories to build their military up, right? And what it was is they were really establishing an industrial base to do what they did in World War II under their own banner, okay? And this is how they got around the armistice, okay? By going elsewhere, building up the means and the industrial base and the apparatus, okay, to just then say, you know what, to heck with you guys, to heck with the Treaty of Versailles. I said armistice, I meant Treaty of Versailles. This is ours. We're just going to start doing it for ourselves, building, we're making weapons, we're making tanks, we're just doing it. And this was done, this was started and established and built up under this medieval method that Winkler talks about in his 1,000-Year Conspiracy book. And what you see, in the United States since World War II, our military-industrial complex has just advanced, astronomically, no pun intended, in its abilities and such. But there's also been influences on, on our society. I identify in the book politicians, congressmen and such that I argue could be targets of the influence of a group like NIMSA. And I do it as kind of a heads up, a warning. But that was part of why I was finding the material so disturbing, because as I pulled the threads forward from World War II, because as you know in my books, I deal a lot with the leading up to World War II. But as I started pulling the threads after World War II, I ended up with a significantly different point of view on what's been going on in the United States since I was born. I was born a month before JFK was assassinated. And it really is, for me, somewhat problematic to realize that for a great portion of my career, I was really serving the military-industrial complex, not so much the country, and didn't know it. So that's quite a pill to swallow. But it felt like it was important, so I had to get that book out. And it's there for folks to take a look at and decide for themselves.
Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine the feeling of investing years of your life into something and then realizing that maybe it wasn't what you had signed up for.
Right. Yeah.
We're almost out of time, Walter, but before I let you go, I want to ask you about another mystery you cover in this book, NIMSA, and that's the Roswell incident.
Mm-hmm.
Pop culture has made us all aware of the story of the Roswell UFO crash, which has been the subject of numerous books and programs and has been debated ad nauseum. The popular theory is that a UFO carrying an extraterrestrial crew crashed in Roswell, New Mexico in early July 1947. The U.S. military then allegedly retrieved bodies and the craft, and some believe we back engineered some of this out-of-this-world technology. However, in your book, you state that Roswell was actually the first attempt at manned spaceflight, which I'm sure some people may find mind-blowing. You go pretty in-depth on the subject of Roswell in another excellent book, Shimmering Light, which I recommend people pick up a copy if they don't have one already. But can you tell us what you found in your research that supports this? Was this actually the first attempt at manned spaceflight?
The first American attempt, yes. The first American attempt. I have for a long time have rejected the ET hypothesis for Roswell. It's very popular. It has been thrown at us for decades. It's the hypothesis that the powers that be want us to embrace. Okay, and when you look at the history, I mentioned it before. When you look at the history of the United States Army, Air Force, and then the U.S. Air Force, the Independent Air Force, when you see that they started America's manned space program, when you look at New Mexico, the bases in you had White Sands and all the bases in New Mexico, of course, where Roswell was at. You had the bomber group there. You had the right guys all in the same place at the same time with limitless money. Mm-hmm. Okay, for the day they could get whatever money they want. And they were operating in strictest secrecy. Now, when you have many of the foremost aviation medicine scientists, okay, who got into their line of work and developed their specialty with the goal of putting man in space, you have those guys together with the rocket geniuses, okay, the guys who shared that dream of putting man in space. And that's why they got into rocketry. And that's really why they were building these things. Okay, that was their personal motive. You have those guys with the aerospace medicine guys. You have secrecy. You have money. You have the resources and the means. What do you think they're going to do? I say, and I lay it out in the book in detail. I lay out all the right guys and the right resources at the right time and circumstances. Of course, they're going to try putting man in space. Of course, the rocket aerospace engineers are going to design and build the craft. Of course, the aerospace medicine guys are going to take everything they know and create a life support system. And of course, they're going to attempt to go out into space. Now, I also lay out the things that were going on at the time and that were being tested. And one of the big, I think it's a smoking gun, is when you look at the Horton brothers flying wing, which we captured, I think, 2 of those, at least one, but 2 of those. Okay. And then you look at the YB-49, which was our huge flying wing that we're told first flew in, I think, September or October of 1947. Okay. Which meant it was being built and developed and such. Okay. And you look at the original, very first so-called witness drawing of what the Roswell craft looks like, you see that it much more resembles the midsection of the Horton brothers flying wing, a version of that, than it ever did, something from another world. Okay. Now, it's the Cold War, I argue, the early years of the Cold War. Okay. There was secrecy was the order of the day. It was better that you put out a story that it was, beings from another world than to say the U.S. Army Air Force tried to put men in space, because God forbid the Soviets learned that we were doing that.
Right.
Okay. And as you know, you've read it in my book, Shimmering Light. I go into the details at my channel, the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. If you go look at the videos, I have a video on this whole thing, and I present the details that I talk about in my book and then some. But yeah, I think there's much more, and I lay it out in my books and in the video. I presented this at Contact in the Desert in 2021. It's there. There's much more evidence for Roswell having been a result of our first attempt at manned space flight than it being anything ET. And I have people yell at me and get mad, and they throw their radio or whatever across the room. They don't want to hear it. I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm talking about, or I'm a disinformation agent and all this stuff. But you know what? I stand on the historical threads and evidence that I pulled and present. And it's, the ET hypothesis to explain Roswell is it's thinner than thin. It's a house of broken matchsticks. Here's the thing. There's a big industry to sell ET and the aliens. Okay. There's a lot of people making money on that. Mm-hmm. They have an interest in keeping ideas like I'm presenting down. They don't want to hear that, because it's a cash cow for them.
That is very true, especially today. It's big business, from TV shows to merch.
Mm-hmm.
For our more politically engaged listeners, with the current political tensions between the U.S. and the rest of the world, what lessons do you hope readers can draw from these hidden historical narratives?
Well, first of all, what's really influenced my perspective on history is, I like to tell people, Western civilization needs to put the mirror down and get over itself. Okay, Western civilization. There's a lot of folks, on this side of the globe, that they think we're the pinnacle, and nothing of any value can be found in the East or in the past. We are just so amazing. Okay, and that's what I mean by put the mirror down. It needs to not be so in love with itself, and it can learn a lot, particularly the farther you go back and be open-minded to things. But by doing this, you also see that there's nothing new under the sun. Mm-hmm. Okay, that you see that, oh, wait a minute, that's this old monster rearing its ugly head. And so we have to be careful, particularly in a so-called free society. Particularly I look at it from the context of being in the United States, because that's where I'm an American. I'm born here. That's where we're at right now. That's where I'm at. And we're supposed to be the big, the big leader of the free world in the West, right? And yet there's some very, and I know this word gets used so much, I mean it with a little f, but fascistic type of thinking has been a problem in American society for several years now. And by keeping an open mind, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think that helps you. It helps you see through, the crazy political peccadillos of a free society. Now, what we have to remember in a free society is to try to avoid and keep at bay the people that are farther out on the ends. Okay, because that's where your trouble is going to start. That's where your trouble is going to come from. And these are the kinds of things that an influence like a NIMSA are going to do their best to take advantage of. Okay, they're going to be pulling strings on both ends to keep us in a state of panic and agitation and discord. They don't want the population to get along with each other and live with each other, they want to keep us in this state of paranoia, this state of division, and all of that. So this is a tactic that they use, and they're using it effectively on the United States, in particular, just keeping this yo-yo, this social yo-yo going on, this pendulum that swings way left then way right. They do not want that pendulum resting in the middle, because that's when we've learned to live together. That's when, we've compromised, and that's when we don't see each other, okay, as the enemy, and when we don't see each other as the enemy, we're able to see them for what they are. Well, this is why they keep these things going. They keep us agitated, So this is one of the classic tactics of this medieval era NIMSA that I talk about in the book. And that's exactly, what's going on here now, as I see it.
And is there a key takeaway you want the readers to have after they finish your book? For example, how might this new perspective transform our understanding of history?
Expand your perspective and your understanding. Be wary of any particular individual or group that tells you, what not to look at, what not to think, okay? That is dismissive of another civilization or a culture, that might just do it differently than your own or this particular special interest group. That's another point, is be very wary of special interest groups, particularly political special interest groups.
Walter, sadly, this is my least favorite part of the show because we have run out of time, and there's still so much more I wish we could cover here tonight. Before you go, where can people keep up with you and all the latest from your research and work?
WalterBosley.com. That's where all my books can be found. And the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. And that's really where you can find all my videos I've done in the past and the new stuff that I continue to do. And, those are the best places to start. WalterBosley.com and the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube.
Walter, what can I say? After every talk, just like every time I finish one of your books, I am reminded that the world is a big and mysterious place with a lot left to uncover. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight and guiding us through some of the darker back alleys of history. I think I speak for all the folks listening when I say it's been a real treat.
Thank you, Frank. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I look forward to doing this again.
That was Walter Bosley, author of NIMSA, How America Lost Its Soul. Make sure you pick up a copy at walterbosley.com. There's a link in the description. And while you're there, also check out his other fascinating books. And don't forget to subscribe to the Walter Bosley channel on YouTube to stay up to date with his latest research. I want to thank you all for taking this journey through time as we ventured into the mysterious corners of history. You can now return your seats to the upright position. Keep your seatbelts fastened until this ship comes to a full and complete stop. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and click the bell if you enjoyed tonight's show. All that being said, take care, be safe, God bless, don't do anything too crazy so we can all meet again next time. And until then, bye-bye.
West of the Rockies with Frank the Engineer on the Independent FM, Los Angeles.